What is it like to go from being, as we heard, a breath of fresh outrage to sitting in the Situation Room?
That's a great question. First of all, thank you all so much for being here and for the honor that you've bestowed upon me and my better half. It's really great to sit up here and to have my family here and close friends, and it's great. I was last here at UCD during the Obama campaign. I think I don't know, maybe all the lecture halls look the same, but it was a room that looked a lot like this. And my family on the Power side was here, and I gave a lecture. I'll get to your question in just a sec, but I gave a lecture. I thought it went very well. I was on my book tour, and then within 48 hours, I'd had to resign from the Obama campaign because I let my Irish temper get the better of me in the heat of battle between Obama and Clinton. So luckily today I have no official role that I can squander with such panache as I did on that trip to UCD. So to your question, it was surreal to go from being a person who had not only been a critic of U.S. foreign policy, but also a reporter, a journalist, like pound the pavement, call people up, stalk them, try to get them to tell you things they haven't told anybody else kind of journalist. And part of what I had spent years trying to get them to tell me was, what was it like in the Situation Room? And how is it possible that, for instance, during the Rwanda genocide, no meeting was even held in the Situation Room at a high level to figure out what might be done. And so the book, A Problem from Hell, that was referenced, I did hundreds of interviews for that, and many of them were designed to just try to be myself as an outsider to be able to visualize what it was like. So then suddenly, Cass and I find ourselves in January 2009. Cass had taught with Barack Obama at the University of Chicago. I had worked with him in the Senate office and on the campaign, on and off. And next thing we knew, we were going into government. And the first challenge, apart from finding the Situation Room, was he and I both had to train ourselves not to answer every question that was posed as ourselves, right? We were so used to just sounding off and look at his, 50 books and, 100 edited books and all the things. I mean, to not just say what you believe the right public policy answer is, but instead to think, okay, what is the settled view of President Obama? He's the one who matters here. He's the one who got elected. And so Cass developed this device for our little household, which is that whenever we were asked a question by a reporter or an academic or anybody, we would start every sentence by saying, as President Obama has said from day one. And then we'd say whatever we wanted to say. And we thought that would both discipline us to make us kind of more, it's a bit behavioral actually, more our answer to that kind of predicate, or make people less likely to notice. But when I walked into the Situation Room, there was no such challenge, because of course no one from the outside is allowed into the Situation Room. And the main thing you feel is just how small it is, how few people are in there. It's in a place you walk by, because the White House mess is very nearby, but there's a special door. Even to get into the door, you need like a special pass. Occasionally at the beginning, I thought, sometimes I wouldn't get invited to meetings I really wanted to go to, and I thought I could just slip in. But again, it's, probably at the height of like everybody filling every chair, there'd be 25 people in there, so it's not like they don't notice, the redhead trying to slip in the back, and so getting the tap on the shoulders was so humiliating. It's way worse than like sitting in your wrong seat at a sports match, when you're trying to move up at a sport match, and then you get the tap on the shoulder, like, no, your seat's up there. It's a lot more humiliating than that. But I would have an intruder alert at the outset, and then very quickly, it got normalized. And then it became, as I joined the cabinet halfway through, it became all about who was sitting where, because the National Security Advisor or the President and his Chief of Staff spent a lot of time thinking about who belongs where and which voices are the primary voices to which everybody else will respond. So there's a whole kind of ecology around this little club, and it never got old. I mean, it always felt special. And I guess the only thing I'd say, not mentioning, what is it they call Voldemort in Harry Potter? He who shall not be named, I guess. So we will not mention he who should not be named for now. But I worry about he who should not be named's Situation Room, because I worry that the culture that President Obama and many presidents, including actually George W. Bush, inculcated of calling on people on the backbench who might be the regional experts or the linguists or or insisting that we not walk out with consensus, but that thoughts that you might have that you sort of a little bit shy about articulating because it feels like the herd is going in one direction. Obama would say, is really everyone in the whole room agrees with the path? Really? Everyone thinks this is like, and then that would, then create a presumption that would lead people out. My sense is that, again, the ritual in the current administration is very different.
Right.
My sense. I'm going to go out on a limb.
Okay. Mind you, that ecology of seating sounds a little like university management.
It might be a little bit, yeah. It's like tenure track.
I had a tough question here, but I'm going to sum it up with an easy one, which is, how do you make America good again?
Politics, unfortunately, and elections, and which is, a lot of people in America want to run away from elections given what happened last year. Other governments, one government in particular, want to run toward our elections and try to do further damage. That would be Russia, but not only Russia. Like now that Russia's been able to do what it was able to do, it's kind of a little bit of open season, to non-state actors, to China, to any country, really. So I hope that some of the political momentum that exists on Capitol Hill and with the special counsel's investigation, Robert Mueller, that will lead. There's the retrospective question and accountability, which is so important as a deterrent and as justice. But then there really critically are these prophylactic questions about what more we can do to prevent it. But we just had a very, this is a good week, actually, after a rough year, where in Virginia, an election that was supposed to be very close was a landslide for the Democratic candidate. Where 2 governorships were won, where the state legislature was turned in a big way. And those are the kinds of elections that have tended not to get enough attention from big donors and even from the media. And yet, if you look at one of the biggest threats to American democracy, it is gerrymandering. You've probably heard about it. These crazy, I don't know if you have it in this country, but I hope it's not going to be one of our exports. But these maps, where like literally you're kind of writing in your friends to the maps so as to have safe Republican districts or safe Democratic districts. Cass is a bigger expert on this than I. But by winning state legislatures, you have a chance to change the maps and rationalize them. And I hope that if Democrats do take back state legislatures, because we've lost an overwhelming number while President Obama was president and over the last 20 years, I hope that we don't then do what the Republicans have done and then sort of right ourselves. But because what happens is, now that only of the 435 House seats in America, congressional seats, only 74 of them actually change parties from Republican to Democrat. So all the incentives are horrible because in those other, 360, the incentives are to avoid a challenge from an extremist in your own party. So you tilt to the extreme, to the right or to the left, rather than the incentive to show your district that you can get things done with people from the other party so as to win the center. And so if we can't fix the gerrymandering problem, our ability to deal with the extremism problems is much worse. But it's politics, politics, politics.
I was going to come on to gerrymandering, actually, with Cass, and we'll do so, but will you allow me one ostensibly tough question?
Yes, please.
And I think it has to be on Syria. You were interviewed by the Irish Times a few days ago, and in the interview you said, well, I would have erred on the side of trying other things in Syria. And I couldn't help but wondering, and I'm sure others did as well, what might those have been? And where, in the toolkit of US foreign policy, where exactly is humanitarian intervention at this point?
I think humanitarian intervention, we're not going to see it for a very long time for a couple reasons. One, the current administration isn't motivated by the suffering of people in our own country, never mind in other countries, as far as I can tell, and they seem cold and indifferent to the suffering caused by the policies that they're putting in place. So the idea that they're going to be suddenly moved by the suffering again far away. Now that said, I think President Trump did carry out a set of strikes in Syria in response to a chemical weapons attack, and I think that was the right thing to do because what the Assad regime was starting to do was, they're like almost like a drug addict, just using, and then they get the taste for using, and then they use again, and there's been a decrease at least since Trump did that. So credit them with that single action. But I don't see them moving in that direction. And then without the United States, certainly I don't see a groundswell from even the leader of the free world now, Angela Merkel. And you can't actually get humanitarian intervention through the Security Council because China and Russia will not render it legal. Our international legal order is at the mercy of Donald Trump, President Xi, and Vladimir Putin, right? Because it's the Security Council that decides when a threat to peace and security is sufficiently grave to warrant collective action. So, I would say that the prospects for humanitarian intervention in a coercive way. Now, what you could get is a ton of political pressure on a country, and then the deployment of peacekeepers in a sort of consensual, non-consensual, where they don't want them, but a government caves to that kind of global pressure. I wouldn't rule that out. But something like Kosovo, Timor, I wouldn't. And then to the underlying question, I don't have a great answer for I certainly don't have a 5-point plan for what would have worked in Syria, but I think that there's a reason that we ended up not striking after the big chemical weapons attack in 2013. There's a set of reasons. We don't need to go into them, but they basically boil down to not having domestic political support, congressional support, or support from our allies. Contrast with Libya, where we had much more of each of those three things. But I think for us to have come forward and said that we were going to strike and then to pull back from striking, even though we got something very significant out of it, which was the end of Syria's declared chemical weapons program. They clearly kept a store of chemical weapons off the books, but there's tons and tons of chemical weapons stockpiles that have been destroyed because of that policy initiative, and so it's important. But I think the United States, and this is true of this administration as well, you have to be very careful not to bluff, and in this case we weren't bluffing, we actually just chose a policy option that seemed, all things considered, to be the better one given how little public support we had. But I think just when the threat of force is out there and the specter is raised and the kind of battle lines are drawn, to pull back from that, I think may have had effects that were not foreseen at the time, negative effects. So that would have been one thing we could have done. And then, Secretary Kerry launched a very aggressive diplomatic initiative the last year and a half with Russia, and I think, had he been able to credibly, I stress credibly, but threaten enforcement and ability to enforce any peace agreement or political agreement that he was able to secure, conceivably he would have had enough leverage to get more done with the Russians. Could we have solved all of Syria in those circumstances? It's so complex, the number of groups on the ground, the extremists by then, Russia, Iran, to solve it just like that wasn't going to happen. But, with a conflict like that, what you seek to do is just mitigate it for some number of Syrians who continue to suffer to this day. And right now there's no diplomacy at a meaningful level, and the killing just goes on.
Thank you for such a full answer to that. Cass, I'd like to really offer yet another accolade. We heard some wonderful accolades in the citation. This is one that's been repeated several times by a gentleman by the name of Glenn Beck, who may be known to people here as a conservative commentator in the United States. He has said that you're the most dangerous man in America.
And he said most evil.
Right. So should we...
tennis game.
Yeah.
And you might see later tomorrow.
That's it? It was only tennis? Maybe more?
I think it was the idea of using behavioral economics to nudge people in certain directions could, if you were in a certain mood, scare you. It'd be hard to get, I think, in that mood. A GPS is a nudge. Are you terrified of your GPS? It's going to take you into a river, or maybe it'll take you in the wrong route. I don't know what got. I actually don't know what got into the Honorable Glenn Beck.
Okay, am I right in thinking you used that quote in one of your books?
Well, for one of my books, which was extremely tedious and no one would buy it, I thought the only way to get anyone to buy it would be put on the back, "The Most Dangerous Man in America." That must be an interesting book.
Okay. In a recent article in Bloomberg, and I'm sure many of you must read your pieces in Bloomberg, you said constitutions should be designed to protect us in extraordinary times. And it seems to me a lot of your recent work has addressed that very question. So my simple question is, does the American Constitution protect Americans in these extraordinary times?
I think so. So we can think of the Constitution here or the Constitution in Germany and the Constitution of the United States, which all have distinctive histories, but kind of inspiring the historical moment that led to them. And the United States Constitution, in a way that has an overlap with the German and Irish experience, there was something in the background, which was the king. And the notion of a powerful king was the American kind of bête noire. And our Declaration of Independence, if you read it in view of that, it kind of comes alive that the king did various things which were inconsistent with the idea that all men are created equal, and also that are inconsistent with the notion that people get to govern themselves. And that is produced a bunch of pages, which has a Bill of Rights, which has an independent judiciary. By the way, one of the grounds for the Declaration of Independence was the king did not respect the independence of the judiciary. And our Constitution grew out of that. And so I feel that it would be extremely surprising if we had any kind of replication of kingly experience given the document. James Madison, probably our greatest thinker, originally didn't want a Bill of Rights. He thought that the structure of the Constitution is enough. You don't need to list the rights. And Thomas Jefferson said, "You're full of nonsense. You need to list the rights." And Madison was persuaded by Jefferson. And his ultimate ground was, if you list the rights, then that's going to permeate the culture. It's not so much that the judges will protect, it's that people will have a lesson in equal dignity, something like that. And in this country, as in the United States, whether people could recite a Bill of Rights or what the text is doesn't matter that much, but that certain kinds of freedom, they're in your blood. And that I think that's the closest thing to a secular God in terms of a safeguard against terrible things happening.
Okay. Impeachment. Not mentioning any names. Clearly, the framers of the Constitution set the bar high. Yeah. Egregious misuse of authority. But one wonders how that gets interpreted today. The procedure seems clear enough, but in a very partisan United States, how can it be possible to meet that bar? That's really the question. And I wonder, we hear a lot about it in the American media. Is it just a liberal fantasy?
Well, I've spent much of the last year in the 18th century on the topic of impeachment, and the reason is a house. Not a person, a house. So we bought a house that was built in 1763, and I think that will resonate in this room as it does in Massachusetts. That house was one of the 4 or 5 houses to which British soldiers went looking for munitions on the very day that the American War for Independence started. The house held munitions. It now has tilted, crazy funhouse floors. Who would want to live in that house? It has ceilings, which the original ceilings are made for people who are really short. Like there's no one in this room short enough to get in that house, because people were short back then. But it was the house where embattled farmers, as they were, took out took up arms against the greatest military force then on the planet, and faced with their military might in circumstances in which they thought on that day, April 1775, right near that house, they were under firm instructions not to fire unless the British fired first. And they didn't expect the British to fire first. And the British did fire. And those colonists, those farmers fought back, and they routed the British. And that's what started independence. Now, the war for independence was, I think, culminated really by the impeachment debates at the Constitutional Convention, where the right to impeach the president was reflected in Bob Dylan's great statement. Sometimes even the President of the United States has to stand naked. And speaking
It's a horrible image right now.
Speaking of Bob Dylan, when he invented rock and roll, he went to England and they hated it. And they said, "What kind of music is this?" And Bob Dylan responded, "This isn't British music, it's American music." And that was the music, really, I think, that the embattled farmers heard when they won independence, and that the Constitution's creators played when they insisted on impeachability of the president for high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, in the blood of every American, whether they were raised in Ireland or France or even Russia, in the blood of every American, and there are plenty of Russian descendants in our country, that music is heard. So if a president engages in egregious wrongdoing, the children, so to speak, of those embattled farmers are going to fire back.
But the bar is high. The bar is high. And there's never not been a cross-party impeachment of a president before, and it requires 2/3 of even if we get the House back in 2018, then we could impeach, correct, if the grounds were there. And Cass's book, which is just out, is amazing on the ground, and looking at practically, what substantively would be legitimate grounds rather than just political. You can't impeach a president just because you disagree with their policies, and the book is very clear about that. But even if we get the House, do impeach because the grounds are there, then it would have to go to the Senate for conviction, which would be is a very high threshold.
So I started the answer by saying I've spent a lot of time in the 18th century, and
attention in our marriage.
So
now.
So I haven't thought really much about President Trump and impeachability, but I'll say a little bit about that, shall I?
Yes.
So you can think of impeachment, if you like, as a particular procedure by which a president is removed. Or you can think of it as a kind of exclamation point and a nuclearization of a system that constrains presidential conduct, let's say. And the president, this is maybe in some ways the least extreme of his controversial actions. He undid the military's judgment that transgender persons should be allowed to serve in the military. He undid that. Now, of the controversial things he has done, that would not be at the top. A federal court said that violated the Constitution of the United States. Okay? That's major, not anticipated, and the law of the land. The Muslim ban, so as it's called, which is the most controversial thing, I think, or one of them in terms of rights violations, that's been struck down by court after court after court. Sometimes even the President of the United States has to stand naked. So our system is extremely robust. In my area of regulation, the number of regulations that the President has undone that have been redone because the federal courts have said it wasn't undone consistently with legal requirements, is really large. The president's undoing of a regulation is headline news. You know, the New York Times, Washington Post, he undid that one. And then 4 weeks later, the federal court says, actually not. It's not undone because it wasn't done in a way that's consistent with our constitutional standards. That doesn't even make it in the newspaper. But in terms of people's actual lives, that's the important one, not the other thing. So in terms of impeachment, I guess what I'd say is it is a high bar, and it sure should be, because to undo an election, even if you didn't like the person, there has to be something pretty terrible. And for someone who's worked for President Obama in particular, to insist that the bar is high for undoing his successor is, that's true, and it would be ungracious and kind of horrific to be calling for impeachment of the guy because you don't like his policies. When I say I feel very confident that if there were an egregious act, the embattled farmers would raise up, that's partly because I believe it, and it's partly because I'm a dedicated follower of a great psychologist named Amos Tversky, who would have gotten the Nobel Prize, who said, I'm an optimist, and it's rational to be an optimist, because if you're a pessimist, you suffer twice.
I think the poll you cite is a jarring and deeply disturbing one, because what it is, I actually use it sometimes in my speeches as proof positive of just how insulated the echo chambers are. So Russia has just at that point, in 2014, lopped off part of Ukraine. Okay, American people may not be registering that, may not, hit home in the way that I would wish it would. Then we have Aleppo, what was just talked about, and bombardment and catastrophic seizure of a largely civilian inhabited town. Under devastating circumstances, and covered basically on American television on a daily basis. And then the cherry on the cake from the Russian standpoint, the massive interference in our election, documented by an largely apolitical group of U.S. officials, including the heads of the intelligence agencies. And notwithstanding that kind of trifecta of terribleness, as you say, 35%, I don't think it's of Americans, I think it was 35% of Republicans supported President Putin, or we may be looking at different polls, but whatever it is, like a jarring. And it reflects the fact that 40% of Republicans get their news from Fox News. Fox News was covering a little bit here or there, Ukraine and Syria, but they weren't covering at all the election interference. Even to this day, they cover, Hillary Clinton's private email server, and phony, conjured up stories of other Clinton scandals, or legitimate concerns that people may have about, things that were done in the past, but making those seem as if they're the most important thing in the present, instead of this question of how we insulate ourselves from future attacks. So I think the Putin poll is kind of less important because suddenly Russia's popular and RT is going to be the most watched show among Republicans. It's less that and more that it speaks to how one can be hermetically sealed into an information universe that could, render President Putin, a favorable figure, notwithstanding what he's done in our own country. And indeed, that's sufficiently not permeated that even now that the GOP, the party of the Republicans, has shifted and is willing now to be more outspoken on Putin, the Republican base hasn't really caught up. Putin's numbers are down a little bit, but they're still way up from what they would have been before 2016 and before Trump and Fox and others started to cover him more favorably. And your second, the Democrat, I'd let maybe Cass wants to answer that. No, I can too. I always can. First, let me say, I think it may be someone, Trump has done a wonderful thing for American politics, I think, and we just saw it play out in the last election, which is people look at Trump, who wasn't a career politician, needless to say, and he's just become president, president of the American Republic, and it makes lots of people who would have before thought they were being presumptuous to run for office think to themselves, if this guy can be president, surely I can run for city council, or whatever, or even president, maybe. We'll see. So I think you're going to see people come from different sectors. People I'm quite taken by, I think Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts, is an extraordinary figure, leader, speaker, pragmatist. I'll let Cass talk about our Massachusetts congressman, who's got great Irish roots, because Cass has a favorite. And the New Orleans mayor, Landrieu, I think is really a compelling figure. Gave a beautiful speech about the monuments, Confederate history, how you bring the South and Southern patriotism and pride in Southernness together with, accountability and justice, given, the hate that now is back in fashion in certain quarters. But these are the people we know. I think we are likely to see people we're not even thinking of enter the race because Trump has made that seem, again, doable and thinkable. But why don't you say a word about Joe?
Yeah, so you know the name Kennedy here? That's familiar. There's a Massachusetts Congressman, Joe Kennedy, who is the grandson of Bobby Kennedy and the grandnephew of President Kennedy. And he's phenomenal.
And real and human.
He's as smart as they come. He's charismatic, but there's no kind of fakery about him. He's fabulous. He's kind of young to be president. He's in just past mid-30s. But I'm hopeful that at some point he'll make a serious run.
And we can't forget Joe Biden, who also is, as he said yesterday on TV when he was Ellen DeGeneres sort of almost went down on her knees and said her Hail Marys and Our Fathers to get him to agree to run, and he's promoting a book about his son, and so he's not going to make a decision until later. But he did say that when he made the decision, he would take the advice of his father, which was, his father said to him, Joe, don't compare me to the Almighty. Compare me to the alternative. So he said so it sounded to me like he was leaning in, that he was leaning in. If that's the test.
He also said at one point, if I can walk, I'll run.